December the 5th, 1962. London wakes to find itself vanished beneath a yellow-brown cloud. The air stings, sulfur lingers everywhere, and familiar landmarks dissolve into nothing. For 4 days, the city ceases to exist. Over 750 lives lost, journeys halted mid-step, rooftops hidden in darkness. But to truly grasp how this worst fog turned ordinary mornings into a waking nightmare, step through the front door and feel what came next. A child stands at the threshold, hand on the cold brass knob, and pushes open the front door. The world outside has vanished. Where there should be a garden, a path, the neighbor's gate, there is only a heavy yellow-brown wall pressing against the step. The air is thick with the sharp sting of sulfur, so strong it catches in the back of the throat. It smells like burnt matches and coal, with a hint of something rotten, as if the city itself has soured overnight. The fog hangs low, dense and oily, swallowing the street lamps until they glow as faint orange orbs, barely visible from the doorstep. A scarf pulled up over nose and mouth does nothing to keep out the taste. It clings to lips, settling on the tongue with a bitter, smoky bite. Each breath feels damp and heavy, as if the air itself has weight. Eyes begin to water almost immediately, blinking against the sting that creeps in with every inhale. The usual sounds of morning, footsteps, a bicycle bell, the distant rumble of a bus are muffled, lost in the thickness. Nothing moves, or if it does, it moves unseen. Even familiar shapes are erased. The hedge at the edge of the garden might as well not exist. The road is gone, replaced by a blankness that stretches in every direction. The only way to find the path is by memory and touch, one foot in front of the other, hand trailing along the brick wall for reassurance. The fog soaks through wool coats and scarves, leaving them damp and smelling of smoke within minutes. White socks and shirts turn grey, then black, as soot settles from the air. Somewhere nearby, a cough echoes, a deep rattling sound, quickly followed by another. It is impossible to say how far away the person is. The fog bends sound, making everything feel closer, more intimate, and yet impossibly distant. The taste of coal smoke lingers, building with each breath, until it feels as if the lungs themselves are coated in grime. Inside, parents mutter about the smell, the colour, the way the fog seems to press against the windows, trying to get in. Towels are wedged under doors, curtains drawn tight, but the smell still seeps through. Outside, the city is unrecognizable, a place stripped of edges and distance, where even the closest street sign is lost in the gloom. For a child, it is as if the world has been erased and replaced with something alien, yellow and endless. The only certainty is the feel of the wall beneath a gloved hand, and the hope that somewhere beyond the fog, the rest of London is still there. Breathing in the smog felt like swallowing a mouthful of ash. Every inhale carried the sharp tang of sulfur and coal, scraping its way down the throat and settling deep in the chest. The air was so thick it pressed against the face and clung to eyelashes, leaving a sticky film that never quite dried. Eyes watered constantly, stinging with each blink, and the urge to cough came in waves, loud rattling coughs that echoed off unseen walls and faded into the yellow murk. Even the act of walking became a careful negotiation. One hand stayed fixed to the rough, damp bricks of the garden wall, fingers slipping on soot and condensation. The pavement underfoot felt slick, every step uncertain, as if the ground itself might vanish. The world was reduced to a few feet in any direction, a private bubble of damp, smoky air, broken only by the scrape of shoes or the sudden startling sound of another person's breath emerging from the gloom. Clothing offered little protection. Woolen scarves meant to keep out the cold, soaked up the fog until they hung heavy and wet around the neck. The smell of smoke seeped into every fibre, and and by midday, white shirts and socks bore black streaks where soot had settled. Gloves grew clammy, and hair stuck to cheeks, slick with moisture and grit. The taste of the air lingered on lips, bitter and metallic, impossible to escape. Sound travelled strangely inside the cloud. The usual rhythms of London, traffic, voices, the distant whistle of a milkman were swallowed up, replaced by the soft drip of condensation from gutters and the distant ghostly bark of a dog. Sometimes footsteps would materialize out of nowhere, close enough to startle, only to vanish just as quickly. Children called to each other, their voices muffled and directionless, as if the fog itself was swallowing their words. The struggle to see became a struggle to breathe. Each gasp felt heavier than the last, lungs working harder to pull in air that offered little relief. The burning in the throat grew sharper, and the urge to wipe away the sting from eyes became a constant battle. Even indoors, the fog found its way in, under doors, through window frames, clinging to curtains and walls. The city's familiar landmarks were erased, replaced by a world defined by touch and sound, by the rasp of breath and the constant gritty taste that settled at the back of the tongue. For many, especially children, the smog was not just something to see or smell, but something to endure with every sense, every step, and every breath. Children step into the fog in small, silent groups, each child reaching for a familiar sleeve or mitten. Arms linked tightly, they inch along the pavement, faces hidden behind scarves soaked dark with soot. The usual landmarks, garden gates, lampposts, and the corner shop have vanished, replaced by a yellowish blur pressing close on every side. Every few steps, someone stumbles or loses their grip, and the chain halts until hands find each other again. The air is thick enough to taste, bitter and metallic, and every breath brings a cough or a sting in the eyes. What would have been a brisk 10-minute walk stretches into half an hour or more. Some children count their steps, others whisper directions, but even the most familiar road feels uncertain. The sound of shoes on wet pavement and the distant hollow ring of a bicycle bell drift in and out of the gloom. Traffic is almost non-existent, and the odd bus or car creeps past, headlights swallowed by the fog before they can light the way. At street crossings, the group hesitates, peering into the blankness, listening for engines they cannot see. The only guide is the cold, damp wall under their fingers and the warmth of a friend close by. By the time the school gates finally appear, everyone's hair and coats are damp, and white collars have turned a grimy grey. The journey has become a test of memory, patience, and trust, one slow, careful step at a time. Inside the school gates, the world did not return to normal. The corridors echoed with the shuffle of wet shoes and the faint, constant cough that seemed to haunt every room. Classrooms glowed with electric light from the first bell to the last, the sun never strong enough to pierce the gloom outside. Windows looked out onto a playground that had vanished, replaced by a yellow-grey blur pressing against the glass. In some rooms, teachers could not see the far wall, let alone the faces of children in the back row. Yet lessons went on. Teachers stood at the front, voice steady, chalk in hand, determined to keep routine alive. Some read aloud by lamplight, their words competing with the low hum of the radiators and the occasional hacking cough. Pupils sat with damp scarves draped over chairbacks, jumpers stained dark at the cuffs where soot had settled. Absences were quietly noted, but registers still filled with names, present or not. Every child was accounted for in spirit. The playground, usually alive with shouts and running feet, stayed eerily silent, the sound of laughter replaced by the soft drip of condensation from the roof. Through it all, a quiet resolve ran beneath the surface. Lessons would continue, even as the world outside disappeared into fog. London's buses crept through the fog at a crawl, headlights swallowed by the yellow gloom. Drivers leaned forward, noses almost to the glass, straining for any glimpse of curb or crossing. In some districts, the fog thickened so completely that even the outline of the next lamppost disappeared. By mid-morning, entire routes were abandoned. Conductors stepped onto the pavement, hands raised in apology, and told passengers to walk the rest of the way. Some buses simply stopped in the road, engines idling, as crews waited for the air to clear. That hope never came. Passengers, wrapped in overcoats and scarves, formed small groups and set off into the blankness, guided only by memory and the scrape of shoes on wet tarmac. Black cabs, usually a lifeline in bad weather, refused fares. Even the most seasoned drivers would not risk journeys across the city when familiar roads had vanished. For many, the only option left was the underground. Below-ground trains ran on time, platforms packed with commuters grateful for the certainty of movement. The tunnels offered a rare sense of normality, a world untouched by the chaos above. Reaching a station meant braving the streets, and many arrived with faces streaked black and lungs aching from the effort. At Heathrow, the runways fell silent. No flights could land or depart. Planes sat stranded on the tarmac, their tails barely visible through the haze. Inside the terminal, passengers waited in growing frustration, listening to muffled announcements that brought no news of departure. Across the city, the usual rhythms of movement had stopped. London, a city built on motion, found itself brought to a standstill by air thick enough to touch. Ambulances crawled through the fog, headlights no brighter than candle flames, bringing more patients than the hospitals could handle. Inside, the wards filled quickly. Beds were lined up in corridors, chairs pressed into service when every mattress was already taken. The air in these rooms was thick and sour, heavy with the sound of coughing and the sharp sting of disinfectant. Nurses hurried from bed to bed, faces drawn and voices hoarse, trying to comfort people who struggled for breath. Elderly men and women, children with tight chests, and anyone with a weak heart or lungs arrived gasping, eyes streaming from the poison in the air. Doctors worked without rest, sometimes making house calls by memory and touch, their hands trailing along the walls in streets where even the hospital's front steps were hard to find. In some wards, oxygen ran low. Metal cylinders were rolled from one patient to the next, rationed to those in the worst distress. Steam inhalers hissed in corners, a last resort when supplies ran thin. The usual order of hospital life had vanished. There was no time for routine, only the endless effort to keep people breathing. By the end of 4 days, London's death toll had reached around 750. Most were the frail and the old, and anyone with a weak chest could be lost. Newspapers tallied the numbers, but inside the wards, each loss was personal. The city's hospitals, already stretched thin by winter, now stood as the front line against an enemy that seeped through every crack, invisible and relentless. Even after the fog began to lift, the corridors echoed with coughs, and the nurses kept watch, waiting for the next call. In kitchens across London, families gathered close, turning their homes into makeshift fortresses against the smog. Towels were pressed into every gap beneath doors and along window frames, each one dampened to catch the smoke before it could seep inside. Parents barked reminders not to open the door any wider than necessary, fearing that even a crack would let the fog invade. Curtains stayed drawn all day, but a yellowish light still managed to filter through, and the smell of coal and sulphur hung in the air, mingling with the scent of boiled cabbage or stewed tea. Children watched as mothers and grandmothers tied wet handkerchiefs over mouths and noses, hoping to filter out the worst of the poison. Grandfathers coughed into handkerchiefs, their voices hoarse, while the wireless played quietly in the background. Some families tried to clear their lungs with bowls of steaming water, leaning over with towels draped above their heads, breathing in the warm, heavy air. Despite knowing coal fires were part of the problem, most households kept them burning. the alternative being a cold that bit just as hard as the fog itself. Outside, the city's silence was broken not just by distant coughing, but by the occasional sound of hurried footsteps. The fog offered cover for anyone with mischief in mind. Shopkeepers worried about their tills, and neighbors whispered about doors left unlocked. Even the police struggled to patrol, the fog swallowing up their lantern beams, and more than one officer found himself lost on his own beat. In the gloom, it was hard to tell friend from stranger, and sometimes the only thing that kept trouble at bay was the hope that everyone else was just as lost. Inside, families stayed close, listening for the scrape of a latch or a knock at the window, waiting for the world to reappear. On the morning of December the 9th, a restless wind swept through London, tugging at curtains and rattling window panes. The change was almost imperceptible at first, a faint stirring in the air, a subtle shift in the light. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the dense yellow-brown wall that had held the city captive began to thin and drift apart. Patches of grey sky appeared, uncertain and streaked, revealing the outlines of rooftops and chimneys that had vanished days before. Streets, once swallowed whole, slowly re-emerged, their edges blurred with soot and damp. It was as if the city had been painted over in black and brown, only now the brushstrokes were peeling away. Children pressed their faces to cold glass, watching as gardens and pavements took shape again. Stepping outside, they found a world transformed but not restored. Every surface bore the memory of the smog. A fine, greasy residue clung to railings, windowsills, and the white stone of front steps. Laundry hung on backyard lines had turned grey or black, ruined beyond saving. Shirts and dresses that had been left out before the fog now carried the stains of 4 days' worth of coal and sulphur, impossible to wash out. Even the air, though clearer, still tasted faintly of smoke and metal. For many, the city felt unfamiliar. Familiar streets appeared altered, their colours dulled and their edges softened by the lingering grime. Children who had spent days in a world of blankness now ventured out cautiously, shoes slipping on wet pavement, eyes searching for landmarks. There was relief, but also a sense of loss, something unspoken left behind in the smog. The memory of those days, of vanished streets and burning lungs, would not fade with the clearing air. Instead, it settled into the city's fabric, a residue as real as the soot on every doorstep. London's air is cleaner now, but the cost of delayed action still echoes. The 1962 smog proved that invisible threats can turn deadly long before panic sets in. Today, over 28,000 Britons die each year from air pollution. The lesson endures. What we breathe shapes how we live, or if we live at all. Share your memories or thoughts below.